So let's talk about the spinal cord. This is the cross section of your spinal column, one of the cervical vertebrae. I know it because all cervical vertebrae has this bifid. Irrelevant. Okay, so let's take a look at this structure. Let's figure out what different gross anatomical parts there. This is obviously the vertebrae itself. Okay, this is back of your back. That's the stuff that you can feel if you touch your spinal cord. This is front. So first of all, can you see this yellow things with blood vessels? Okay. This is what's called epidural space. It's filled with fat. Okay. Ever heard about epidural anesthesia? This is where the injection goes. Now here you can see two gray layers clinging to each other, being completely adjacent to each other. Can you see that? So this is dura mater, the outermost, and arachnoid mater. They basically, there's no space between them. They one and immediately another. We good so far? Here, that space is subarachnoid space. This is where the cerebrospinal fluid circulates around your spinal cord. Okay? This gray layer, that's probably numbered, I guess, 28, I suppose, 28. That's pia mater. You good so far? Now we're moving on into the spinal cord itself. First of all, spinal cord, on the cross-section, you can see that it is symmetrical. And it is indeed symmetrical, so left and right sides basically mirror each other. You can see gray matter, which in this model is more like light brown. And you can see white matter here. Are you following me? So as we discussed before, gray matter is the accumulation of neuronal bodies, somas, and white matter consists of axons of neurons. Because axons are myelinated, myelin's white, and this is how we know. So far we good? Now this little depression here is called anterior median fissure, and this little depression here is called posterior median sulcus. I'm sorry. I need to mute this. Okay, we good? Fissure and sulcus have no physiological meaning. They're just there. So far, any questions on like the general anatomy? We're going to go back to the white and the gray matter. But first, I'm going to grab the spinal column from someone who definitely has scoliosis. And the conversation about the spinal cord is virtually impossible to have without talking about peripheral nervous system. So we'll have to include some concepts from there, okay? So this is your spinal cord within the spinal column. Are you with me? These projections here are spinal nerves. This is the peripheral nervous system already, so just letting you know. Now this model is not ideal because your spinal cord as the cord, as the single structure, it ends at the level of approximately first lumbar vertebrae. Right about here, this is what happens to your spine. So this is the cord. It ends with this cone-like structure called conus medullaris. Now if you think about it, spinal cord extends all the way down from the brain stem. And if you just leave it like that, it's going to be wobbling within your vertebral column. Makes sense, right? Like if you just hang it, it's going to be wobbling. You don't want it to wobble for obvious reasons. So in order for it not to wobble, it's attached to the coccyx, the tailbone, by filum terminale. Filum is basically like a rope, terminale, terminal. We good so far? Sometimes in children you can find certain anatomical abnormalities when this attachment is too tight. The spinal cord is kind of a little bit too stretched, and that makes it, a lot of potentially bad consequences. Okay. Now I told you that it ends at L1 as the cord, but there are offshoots, basically nerves, a whole bunch of nerves that go like this. This is called cauda equina. A pretty romantic name. Cauda equina from Latin means the horse tail. Okay, cauda tail, equina horse. So far we good? Why it's important that your spinal cord ends approximately at L1. You can take a really big ass needle and stick it all the way through skin, the subcutaneous tissue, the muscles between the vertebrae, penetrate dura and arachnoid matter, and get in that sweet spot where still the CSF circulates. And you can suck this precious fluid doing a spinal tap or lumbar puncture. Does that make sense? This is why lumbar puncture is lumbar. Because if you do sampling of CSF at the level of neck? You can, but it's a stupid thing to do because you can damage a spinal cord and paralyze a person. See what I'm saying? This is why we do it at the level of about L2, L3, so we don't damage a spinal cord and we can sample CSF, and it has an enormous diagnostic value. Any questions so far? Okay. So we're going to talk about now sort of functional anatomy of the spinal cord. It goes without saying that main function. The spinal cord is signal transmission. Okay, signals go up, signals go down. Now, while I'm getting rid of this writing, I have a question for you. We have motor signals and we have sensory signals, right? So in relation to CNS, central nervous system, motor signals, where do they go? Do they go away from CNS, or do they go to the CNS? And the same question is for sensory. So go ahead. Huh? Absolutely. So motor signals are formed in the CNS, and they send out sensory signals are formed in the periphery, like your sensory receptors, and they're sent in. Now, does spinal cord do any sort of integrative job? Yeah, like reflexes, for instance, repetitive movements. We're not focusing on them though. So, big question. Which part of the brain consciously perceives your sensations? Let me rephrase it even simpler. Which part of CNS consciously perceives?
Your brain.
Yeah, perfect, your brain. And same is true, brain is the part of CNS that forms motor responses, conscious motor. So the fact that I do this, that's my brain. Okay? Now, for sensory signals to get to the brain, they have to go which direction? Up or down? Up. And for motor signals to reach muscles, they have to go down. So you should always remember that all the motor tracts or pathways that we're going to talk about in 5-7 minutes motor tracts are descending, while sensory tracts are ascending. Any questions about this part? Okay. So while tracts represent kind of a bigger part of the discussion about spinal cord, let's get rid of gray matter first. Okay, and gray matter in the brain can be divided into three main substructures. So look at this. Look at your models. This one, which is number 36 on the model, it is so-called ventral horn. Structure that numbered 37 is lateral horn, and structure that numbered 38, for obvious reasons, is the dorsal horn. Now, they all have different functions. Remember, gray matter contains neuronal bodies, okay? And what do they do? So, ventral horn contains bodies of neurons that are somatic. Anyone remembers what somatic means?
Body.
Okay, I'm gonna add my bad. Somatic motor, or what we call efferent neurons. So, somatic motor neurons, which organs do they control? There's only one answer. Skeletal muscles. So your ventral horns contain the bodies of neurons that control your skeletal muscles. This part's clear? Awesome. Then you have lateral horns. So these guys contain autonomic motor. So here we're talking about organs, smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, glands. You following me here? Still somatic. And as you can imagine, dorsal horns contain just sensory neurons. Okay? Does it make sense? Okay? So, the conversation about this is impossible, as I mentioned before, without stepping sort of over the line and going into a little bit of peripheral nervous system. So look at this. So these are dorsal horns. Please yell at me if you can't see what I'm showing, because I saw Emma just. So please tell me, I can turn. So these are dorsal horns. You see these yellow structures here? Each tiny individual wire is a rootlet, and altogether they form a dorsal root of the spinal nerve. So these dorsal roots contain only sensory neurons. Does that make sense to you? Because they kind of feed into the dorsal horns. Here at the bottom, you can see same kind of similar yellow wires. Those are ventral rootlets of the ventral root of the spinal nerve. And they carry only motor neurons. But in the nerve itself, what happens to them? They bundle together. Does that make sense? I think the ideal analogy for this is the highway. Okay, when you drive, say, I-90, well, I've seen even better, like I-20 down south in Texas and Louisiana. It's the two-way street, okay? It goes both eastbound and westbound, right? In some cases, you may not, like you can drive eastbound, you may not see the westbound part because they're so far apart. But at the end of the day, in some place, they will come together. Does that make sense? So basically, same idea. You have two-way street, they are spatial, like slightly separated, but they will bundle up in the spinal nerve. Motor fibers will always remain motor. Sensory fibers will always remain sensory. Because it's, at the end of the day, neuron can transmit signal only one direction. Makes sense, right? Following me? Questions? Okay, I consider we're good here. So we figured out gray matter. Now we're going to figure out the white matter. So anatomically, this part's called funiculi. So you have, obviously, dorsal funiculus, lateral funiculus, and ventral funiculus. So ventral, lateral, dorsal. But within those funiculi, actually, we have what's called neuronal tracts or pathways. I am more used to the term pathway, but we have kind of a saying, by the way people talk, you can tell if they have more fundamental physiology background or medical anatomy background. A physician would use the word tract, okay? But they're synonyms. So now, let's talk about the tracts in the spinal cord. Now, before we move any further with the tracts pathways discussion, just want to highlight a tricky question. Do we have nerves in the central nervous system? It's actually 1 out of 10 question. It's really easy. Do we have nerves in the central nervous system?
Yes.
No. we don't have nerves. We have neurons, but we don't have a nerve as an anatomical structure. Nerves are entirely in the periphery. Does that make sense? It's not, we don't have individual nerves. So the tract in the CNS, in the central nervous system, is as close as it comes to a nerve by the function. Are you following me? Because a nerve is a road. This is basically a road. It just doesn't, it's not separated structurally from others. There's no real physical boundaries. So tracts, as we mentioned, can be of two types, which are no? Rand already mentioned them. Tracts in the spinal cord, direction-wise, can be going up or down, meaning they can be ascending or descending. So ascending tracts will be what? What kind of information, huh?
Sensory.
Absolutely. And descending will be motor. So far we clear? Well, there are 3 ascending tracts that you must know. And I'll explain what exactly you need to know. First of them is, well, let's do dorsal white column. Another one is spinothalamic. And another one is spinocerebellar. So if you look especially at these 2 terms, you can clearly see that these tracts are ascending, right? They go from spine to the thalamus, from spine to the cerebellum. Good? Understood? So what's their function? Dorsal white column conveys sensory inputs of touch, vibration, body position. Okay? That part makes sense? Now, in the lecture notes, you probably noticed that there are 2 subdivisions of the dorsal white column, funiculus gracilis and funiculus cuneatus. I don't care. It's not going to be on the exam. So long as you know dorsal white column, you're fine. Okay? So, the tract, the entire thing consists of 3 neurons. And it delivers the information to the somatosensory cortex. Okay? Spinothalamic is responsible for transmitting signals of pain and temperature. Also has 3 neurons. And the name is kind of deceiving. It does go through the thalamus, but it also conveys the signals to the sensory cortex. Does that part make sense? Can you consciously appreciate the sensation of a touch? Obviously, yeah, pain, temperature, because it all reaches your cortex. What is the function of spinocerebellar pathway? Remember last time we were talking about what cerebellum does? Makes your movements precise. In order to do that, it has to receive the information about your body position. So this is exactly the function of spinocerebellar tract. So it conveys the information about the body position to the cerebellum via two neurons. You following? That makes sense? So the neurons are named in an extremely creative way. They named like first order, second order, third order. Here's what happens. Look, for instance, there's a touch sensation in my palm. Okay. So first order neurons, look, they will convey the signal from my palm to my spinal cord. You following me? Second order neurons will synapse with them, and they will convey the signal to the thalamus. Third order neuron will synapse with the second order in the thalamus and will bring the signal to the cortex. Does that make sense? So this is one of the common principles of neuronal tracts. Which is relay. Okay? All of them, including descending tracts, use the relay principle. Second important feature, they're symmetrical. So you have dorsal white column. Look at this. I'm going to show it to you. So you've got dorsal white column approximately under my thumb. You have it on the right side, and you have it on the left side. Okay? They're not really shown on the model. I'm just telling you where it is. Are we clear? And the third principle, which I'll throw at you now and we can talk about it. Well, kind of. Well, not really talk about it. They decussate. Some of them. Many, actually. The fancy word sounds very French. Means that they cross over to another side. Does that make sense? The decussation point is located around medulla oblongata, about here. Okay? That's all. So those are features of the tracts. For now, we're good? So I've got ascending. Now let's talk about descending tracts. Here. You need to know there are 5. 3 make sense, 2 don't really. So the first one is corticospinal. It's the most important. Fine motor movements. So you're writing now, you're flipping the notebook, okay? You nodding to my words. That's all corticospinal tract. Okay, does that make sense? Tectospinal tract. Controls the movement of your neck muscle, specifically when you follow the moving object. So, head and neck muscles, following the moving object. Vestibulospinal tract. And they may actually innervate the same muscles. Vestibulospinal tract is responsible for your balance maintenance. Now this is something that unless you think about it, you don't really appreciate it. If you will try to stand, if you try to stand on bossy ball on one foot, it will be hard to keep the balance. Like I'm standing on my left foot now, and I can keep the balance. But I can talk to you. I don't have to really focus on me keeping the balance, right? I can't. You're not sending conscious signals to different parts of your leg to keep the balance. The parts of the motor cortex and cerebellum, they do it for you, and they send the information through the vestibulospinal tract. You with me so far? And a couple of minor ones. Cerebrospinal and reticulospinal. They collectively kind of responsible for muscle tone and posture. Questions? Miranda?
What's the second word after muscle?
Tone.
Oh, tone.
Tone. Your muscles are constantly contracted all the time, to some degree. So, I'm going to put one really interesting, well, not really interesting, it's not that interesting, frankly, but important picture. Very simple. So this is your motor cortex, okay? We're going to talk about the number of neurons now. You have a motor neuron that goes all the way down in the spinal cord. So that's your spinal cord. It's going to be a very, very primitive picture, I promise you. And so that's the spinal cord. Until it reaches a certain level, it will reach its counterpart, and it will synapse with its counterpart in the ventral horn. Does that make sense? And this neuron will go from the ventral horn through the spinal nerve and will control muscle. Okay, does that make sense to you? So you have neuron that goes from motor cortex via the spinal cord and synapses with the second neuron in the ventral horn. That second neuron controls the muscle. We clear? Few more terminological things. This is called upper motor neuron, which is, duh. And this one is called, very unsurprisingly, lower motor neuron. Good? I have a question. Can you relax your muscles now? Not all of them, obviously. Can you, you relaxed your muscles of the hand because you put down the pen, okay? Now, it's kind of an interesting thing. Your muscles, trying to express it, they don't really have relaxation point. I mean, you can't. So basically, your muscles have two states. They are contracted or not. Are you following me? So like they always, first of all, they always, in a healthy person, all the muscles are baseline contracted. There is some contraction all the time, baseline. Are you following me? From that baseline, they can either contract or not. So when they contract, like they contract. When they aren't, that's what we call relaxed. Is that clear? Here's an interesting story. Lower motor neuron here is always excitatory. So you may ask, what the hell? If it's always excited, or if it sends signals and contracts our muscles, why we're not in a constant, contracture? The answer is here, because your upper motor neurons can be excitatory or inhibitory. Does that make sense? Which means, if upper motor neuron that sends the signal to lower is excitatory, you're going to contract your muscles. If upper motor neuron that sends the signal is inhibitory, you're going to relax your muscles. We clear? This will come important when I will talk about some kind of fascinating stories about the spinal cord. So far we good? I did a nice wrap-up yesterday. I'm going to do the wrap-up, stop this video, and then we're going to talk about fun stuff, which is always problems. The whole pathway for me shaking someone's hand. So imagine that, another person and I, we grab each other's hands, and this person squeezes mine. Okay? So that squeeze is detected by sensory receptors, and sensation of touch and squeezing goes through the first order neurons to the spinal cord. First order neurons synapse in the dorsal horn with the second order neurons, which run all the way to the thalamus. They synapse with third order neurons. I'm talking about ascending tract. It's all dorsal white column now. That go all the way to my sensory cortex. So my sensory cortex realizes, okay, there is a squeeze. Okay? Relays the info to the motor cortex. Motor cortex says, okay, I'm going to crush this guy. Okay? Sends the signal through the excitatory upper motor neuron, which relays it in the ventral horn to the lower motor neuron, which sends the input to my muscles, activates them, and I crush the guy. Good? This is kind of the whole pathway of conscious perception of sensation and conscious response to that sensation. Any questions on this part? So what kind of question you can get? Which of the following tracts do this? Or what is the function of, what kind of signal the spinothalamic tract conveys? Are you following me? So you got to know sensory motor, ascending, descending kind of signal. Okay, anatomy-wise, the only picture, and believe me, that's going to be enough. The only picture that you're going to see on the anatomy exam regarding the tracts, you have seen probably the cross-section of the spinal cord with the red and blue colored spots on the notes. It's close. That's that. You're going to see that. And more than you want to. Okay? I mean, there's going to be like 4 or 5 questions on this. You should know like lateral corticospinal, ventral corticospinal, dorsal spinocerebellar, ventral spinocerebellar. It's purely identification, just identification. Questions? Okay.